Welcome to space, or welcome to a space. It looks black to you because you have no point of reference. But maybe that's what space is, a big nothing. Or when I say space, maybe you think of outer space. There. But outer space is not a big nothing. It's filled with places. Each star is a place. Just a ball of fire, you say? Maybe, but each star has a location. We can measure the distance and draw a map to it. We can take a picture of it. Many stars even have names. And don't forget the planets. Take all that away, and you just have a space. Okay, so if we take a space and put something in it, a flame, a candle, or me, does that make it a place? Well, maybe technically, but it may not make it much of a place. Hi, I'm Courtney McCune. How much of a place is this? Let's see, it has dirt and rocks and some wind and a few plants, but there's no library, no mall, no fast food, oh yeah, and no people. So is it a space or a place? It's a place. From a human perspective, it too might not be much of a place right now. Of course, even without humans, it is an ecological environment. A habitat for all sorts of little creepy crawly things and animals that live there. This is part of the Sonoran Desert. Space is like a big stage, and place is what gets built on that stage, or walks onto it, or falls on it. Our focus is called geography. Geo means the earth, graphics means description. Describe the earth. But is geography just a matter of describing the earth? Like, this is a mountain, and that's a tree. No, as you'll see, it's a great deal more. Geography is the story of the earth and the people who live on its surface. We'll get to the people a bit later, but first, Earth. Since we photographed Earth from outer space, it's often been called the Big Blue Marble, but it's not. A marble is a piece of dead rock or glass, but Earth is very much alive. It's the largest ecological system. That means there are several processes, activities, things that move and interact and keep it going. One process is the atmosphere, which we think of as climate and weather. More scientifically, it's called meteorology, and you see it illustrated with computer graphics and NASA satellite photos every night on your local TV newscasts. Then there's something called the lithosphere, which is Earth's outer crust, really about the top 50 miles or so. And that's made up of big pieces of rock that actually move. They're called continental plates. You can't see them move, it's very slow. For example, there was a time when South America and Africa was just one big lump. But eventually, their continental plates pulled apart over a period of about 237 million years. Up on the surface of Earth, things are affected by erosion. Take Arizona's Grand Canyon, for example. I know we sometimes tell tourists we dug it with shovels, but it was actually made by the force of the Colorado River eroding down through a mile of rock over a few million years. Erosion, by the way, is the movement by water or wind of dirt, rocks, minerals, organic materials like leaves and plants, dead animals and bugs, all of this mixed together eventually forms soil. Most of us have been told about the hydrosphere, but we may not know it by that name. This is the simple process where the water in oceans and lakes and rivers evaporate, float up to the sky, make clouds, and eventually fall down again as rain or snow. And then, probably nearest and dearest to our hearts, is the biosphere. We like it best because it includes us. Biosphere is the whole system of living things, like people, cows and horses, roses and daisies, black olives and all the things that go into pizza. In short, all living things and the ecosystems they operate in. We'll talk more about ecosystems in a bit. But remember that all of these things, the atmosphere, lithosphere, erosion, soil formation, the hydrosphere, and the biosphere, involve processes that shape the Earth's surface. Of course, the Earth's surface also gets shaped, at least occasionally, by other processes, other events that we see on the television news. Earthquakes, landslides, floods, forest fires, avalanches, and volcanoes. This program follows the geography education standards developed by the National Geographic Society. And yet, you will notice that almost all of the examples we'll use are in the state of Arizona. We can do this because the 113,000 square miles that make up Arizona contain just about every kind of physical and cultural geography that exists in the world. Well, we don't have an ocean or a rainforest, but we have just about everything else. You'll see what I mean as we look at Arizona's physiographic regions. Remember, graphic means description, and physio means physical. The regions describe the state physically. Let's begin at the top with the Canyon Plateau region. In this region are some of the most spectacular geographic images to be found in the United States. Of course, there is one of the most famous sites in the world, the Grand Canyon. On the Utah border is huge Lake Powell, man-made by Glen Canyon Dam. The many canyons it fills create more beachfront property than the entire west coast of the United States. Toward New Mexico, on the Navajo Reservation, is Monument Valley, which you've seen in many old Western movies. And a bit south of there is Canyon de Chelly. There is the Painted Desert, which isn't really a desert at all, but a high arid steppe. West of there you'll find Sunset Crater, the last volcano to erupt in Arizona about 900 years ago. Close by is Meteor Crater, which was made in a matter of moments when a meteorite from outer space slammed into Earth. Mount Humphrey is an old volcano, 12,670 feet high. That puts it up in the range of America's highest points. Its peak is above the timberline, and technically that area is alpine tundra. So far, these are all pretty desolate-looking places, but the lower portion of the Canyon Plateau region includes the world's largest forest of ponderosa pines, as well as the lush White Mountains. The lower edge of the region is the beautiful Mogollon Rim. What is called the Central High Basin and Mountain region runs diagonally across the state. Here you'll find areas that look like parts of the American Midwest or Eastern states. And you'll also find the eerie-looking Joshua Tree Forest. Also scattered throughout the region are numerous rugged areas such as the Salt River Canyon. And the Superstition Mountains, famous for the Lost Dutchman's gold mine. Some such ranges offer a wide variety of climates and vegetation depending on their height. Take the Bradshaw Mountains, for example. They appear rocky and desert-like from below, but drive up to the top and you find a thick forest. And then, especially in the southeastern portions of the region, one finds rolling grassland. The third physiographic region includes the lower basin and ranges, the very identifiable Sonoran Desert. Parts of it include forests of literally millions of saguaro cacti, which grow only in this desert, as well as scores of other unique botanical species. Parts of the region can seem desolate, with endless stretches that appear simply flat and dry, interrupted occasionally by relatively small mountain ranges, typically 3,000 to 4,000 feet in elevation, too low and too hot to support thick vegetation, much less forest areas. One notable exception is Kitt Peak, which around 7,000 feet is the site of a solar observatory. Then back across the desert to the west, near Yuma, is an outcropping of sand dunes, no different from those of North Africa's Sahara Desert. It seems ironic that Arizona's major cities are to be found not in the more comfortable high basin and mountain region, but in the Sonoran Desert, like Phoenix, the fifth largest city in America, with its metro area totaling more than 3 million people, sprawls across a hot desert valley, which one day in the 1990s experienced a record high temperature of 122 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. A bit earlier we mentioned ecosystems, or more properly, ecological systems. What are they? Earth is a community of organisms and elements that depend on each other to survive. Think of the motor in a car. If some part breaks, it stops running. Each part depends on the others to make the system work. It's the same in nature. Think of all the creatures, large and small, that live in a forest. They need water, food, places to nest or find shelter. Take any of those away and they can't survive. The ecosystem breaks down. Sometimes an ecosystem is destroyed or altered by events in nature. A drought can jeopardize the water supply. A forest fire can be disastrous. But often in the past, it has been human activity that threatened an ecosystem. In the 1930s in the American Midwest, poor farming practices led to serious erosion of the topsoil. When a drought came, and combined with dry winds, the area became known as the Dust Bowl. A logical question would be why certain types of ecosystems develop in the locations where they do. Often as not, it's influenced by the physical makeup in that part of the Earth's surface. One simplified example, why are the big, dry Sonoran and Mojave Desert ecosystems where they are when a bit farther west lies the Pacific Ocean with its lush coastline? Well, a big part of the answer is the Sierra Nevada mountain range that is too high to let the wetter weather systems reach inland. As with any other job, the geographer uses tools, the most basic of which is a map. Drawing maps is something we all often do, starting at a very young age. With education, we use maps that are more sophisticated and provide more information. Take a typical state map. It will tell us what roads to travel between two locations, the distance, whether it is freeway or dirt roads. Similar maps are used by sea captains and airplane pilots. If you think about it, the big green signs on the highways are part of life-size maps. In recent years, we've seen the development of GPS, or Global Positioning Systems, an electronic signal sent from a unit on a boat, a plane, and on some automobiles, is constantly tracked by a satellite to indicate exactly where on Earth that vehicle is. But there are other kinds of maps as well. Maps that don't so much tell you how to get there, but what is there, or other information. In election years on television, we see maps colored in red and blue to indicate which political party won the race in a given state. A topographical map tells about the landscape and terrain of an area, whether it's flat or small hills or steep mountains. The most interesting maps, which most of us seldom see or use, are of the floor of the world's oceans. Here, for example, we can see that the Hawaiian Islands are actually tops of an undersea volcanic mountain range. And here is the Mariana Trench, a hole that is as deep below the Pacific Ocean as is Mount Everest high above sea level, more than 29,000 feet. And as with everything else today, there are new tools for mapping and storing information about a specific location. Not only physical things here today, but also what was there historically. It's called a GIS, or Geographic Information System. It is a computer system that captures, analyzes, and displays that information. Another tool used in geography, maybe not so much by scientists, but by normal people, is a mental map.
I walk out of my house, I walk down Montebello, I take a left, and then I go straight, and then I take another left, and then go straight, then take a right.
How do you get to school?
I get on the school bus.
Left to its own devices, this 4.5 billion-year-old ball called Earth would spin along as a happy ecosystem without harming itself. That is to say, if there weren't 6 billion human beings here. But a mere 10,000 years ago, and that's like yesterday in the big scheme of things, the planet had only 1 to 2 million people. What has allowed such rapid growth? There have been 3 major factors. The first is agriculture. For most of human history, man wandered and gathered what edible plants he could find, or hunted wild animals. But if you could grow your own crops and raise livestock, your chances for survival increased significantly. And it was about 10,000 years ago that humans began the practice of agriculture. But even with this advancement, populations grew at a very gradual rate. Even after another 8,000 years, the 1st century AD, the entire Earth had only about 170 million people. As recently as the 1830s, Earth still had less than 1 billion people. Then it really took off. By 1950, it was 2.5 billion. Then, only 30 years later, 1980, it was 4.5 billion, and 6 billion in 2000, and estimated by 2050 to be 9 billion people. Why such rapid growth? Well, of course, the more families there are, the more children, the more grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. But other 20th century factors really tell the tale. The processing of food to be clean, healthy, nutritious, and vitamin-enriched. The development of antibacterial agents and antibiotics. Certainly the incredible discoveries in medical research. And one you may not have thought of, sanitation. This is a city's sewage treatment plant. Not the most pleasant place to hang out, especially if you have a nose. But it is the scientific development that most protects us from disease and epidemics. Birds and some animals migrate, following the milder climate. It's about survival. We humans tend to move about also. Sometimes conditions in our lives push us to get away from bad situations. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the totalitarian regime in East Germany pushed people to risk their lives to escape past the Berlin Wall. In parts of Africa, civil wars, drought, famine, and epidemics make people want to migrate. From Cuba, people risk their lives in leaky, overloaded boats to cross 90 miles of ocean to freedom in the States. And from Mexico, more than 100 die each summer trying to walk across the waterless, deadly, hot southern deserts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, searching for economic opportunity. Some migration is motivated by less serious circumstances, the opportunity for a new job in a different part of the country, the search for a milder climate, or maybe just a better house on the other side of town. And speaking of towns, atop a mesa on the Hopi Indian Reservation in northeastern Arizona sits a village called Old Oribe. It is the oldest continuously inhabited community in North America. Folks called it home long before Columbus sailed across the Atlantic, long before the Spanish conquistadors saw the American continent. At the same time, a couple hundred miles to the south and west, in a flat valley, there were villages occupied by people called the Hohokam, farmers who developed an irrigation system. It's in the nature of human beings to live together in communities, and in a community setting, people tend to get things organized. Look at today's cities. The physical geography is usually planned. Stores and shops are developed in strips or centers or malls. Factories are in designated industrial areas. A great deal of money is spent on highways and streets. Citizens want entertainment and culture. And of course, politically, we are organized from state legislatures to city councils, down to the newest idea, the neighborhood association. How does a big city become a big city? There are basically two ways. We've been flying over what we'd think of as Phoenix, a seemingly endless stretch of development, but it's not really one city. It's an example of a linked suburb area. Phoenix is the center and the largest, but it's surrounded by a dozen or more significant suburbs with names like Tempe, Mesa, Scottsdale, Glendale, and others. Each was founded as a separate town, then grew together into a metropolitan area. By contrast, 100 miles to the south, Tucson is a single primate city. Founded in 1775 as a northern outpost of the Spanish Empire, it grew over the centuries, but grew primarily as Tucson. Even today, it has only a couple of outlying suburbs. And while looking at Tucson, it's worth taking a moment to mention architecture and the kind of physical settlements people develop. In Tucson, one sees far more Spanish-style architecture than in other parts of Arizona. This is because prior to 1820, Tucson was owned and occupied by Spain. Of course, what we think of as Spanish architecture was originally Moorish architecture, transported in the 8th century when the Moors from North Africa conquered what we today know as Spain. Usually there are reasons for the physical look of a city and the type of homes people build. In cold weather areas, we find high-pitched roofs that allow the snow to fall off. Desert cities, before air conditioning, built homes with 9 and 10-foot ceilings that allowed the hot air to rise above the people in a room. Or, if you visit Mesa, Arizona, you would notice very wide streets. This was by design, so that a wagon pulled by teams of horses would have plenty of space to turn around. Of course, an important question is, why does a town get started at a certain location in the first place? Let's go back to Old Oribe. Logically, it was built on the top of a mesa for protection against enemies. Some places begin as military posts. Tucson, for example, was a Spanish fort, called a presidio, there to defend against Apache raiders. Generally, pioneers settled in places where they thought they could make a living and survive. Usually the key was agriculture, but not always. In 1863, Prescott became the Arizona territorial capital because it had to go somewhere. President Lincoln had sent a team out to establish a government. They found a place near the center of the territory. The climate seemed reasonable, and it was pretty close to the recent gold discoveries in the Bradshaw Mountains. So they established a capital and named it Prescott. Some Arizona towns, like Winslow and Holbrook, sprung up along the path of the newly developed railroad. Yuma became a hot property as early as 1849, when those headed to the California gold rush discovered it was about the only place where the mighty Colorado River was calm enough to cross. Then there are towns founded by folks who migrated as a group. Buckeye, Arizona, was settled by folks from Ohio, the Buckeye State. It's well known that many towns were established by Mormon pioneers, sent from Utah by their leader, Brigham Young. These Mormon towns initially fit a category called cultural enclaves, just as other parts of the country had German towns, French towns, or Polish and Irish sections of big cities. In many places in the world, towns spring up around successful mining claims. Globe and Miami, Arizona, are two which, after a century, are still tied to that industry. Other mining towns like Jerome in central Arizona and Bisbee down near the Mexican border are cases where the mines played out years ago, but folks have picked up the slack with other industries, including tourism. Some other places didn't survive at all. The communities of Veckel and Gillette are today little more than fading memories. In recent decades, we've seen the phenomena of whole new towns being established from scratch as commercial ventures by real estate developers. The first such was Dell Webb's Sun City, which dates to 1960. Over on the Colorado River in 1963, industrialist Robert McCullough bought some 26 square miles of raw desert and called it Lake Havasu City. But what put it on the map was when in 1968, McCullough went to England, bought the London Bridge, had it dismantled and shipped to Arizona, where it was reconstructed over a water inlet at Lake Havasu City. More recently, 30 miles north of Phoenix is the start-from-scratch city of Anthem, Arizona. In the old science fiction movies, we'd see a creature from another planet land on Earth and say, "Take me to your leader." It was assumed that this space alien was exactly like all the other citizens in the culture of his distant planet. But among Earth people, we couldn't make that assumption because Earth has an incredible number of different cultures. Culture is a term used to cover the social structure, language, belief system, institutions, education, attitudes, business practices, technology, land use, the design of cities, art, food, and traditions of humans. It defines a whole way of life. What does that have to do with geography, you may ask? The answer is everything. Remember, a big part of geography is the study and understanding of the different cultures that occupy and use the Earth's surface. It's called cultural geography. Any city of more than 3 million people will hear languages and see faces from throughout planet Earth. In Arizona, however, there is a specific cultural bonus in that more than 5% of the population, some 256,000 people, are indigenous Native Americans, or Indians. When you look at some old Western movies, you get the impression that all Indians are pretty much the same, and that would be completely wrong. Historically, there were many hundreds of different tribes in North America, and whereas some were related like cousins to others, each had its own cultural characteristics. Their housing differed. Music differed. Some were farmers. Some were raiders. One formal factor that identifies a culture is a unique language, and there were hundreds of different Indian languages. Today, tribes throughout North America are actively engaged in cultural preservation efforts, and at the top of the list is the effort to save ancient languages. Other factors of culture include the spiritual and religious practices. Laws and political structures will differ. as do the ways people earn a living. You are not likely to live your entire life having no contact with the world's other cultures. It is important to understand and appreciate the diversity of people. If for no other reason than that the lack of understanding and appreciation can lead to terrible conflict. In geography, you will often hear the word region. A region is a place or a group of places, usually near to each other, that have something in common. It could be as small as a neighborhood or as big as a state. For example, in this city, you might say that this is the junkyard region, because several auto wrecking companies are clustered together here. In the study of geography, there are 3 types of regions. The first is a formal region. That's where the things in common are pretty much natural and permanent, like people speaking the same language. Then there are functional regions that are organized around a focal point. For example, for many decades, Detroit, Michigan has been a leading auto manufacturing region. Or locally, the big mall and the stores around it make this a retail region. Finally, there are perceptual regions, which have to do with how people think of an area. For example, parts of the American South have a lot of people who are fairly conservative Christians, so the area is sometimes referred to as the Bible Belt. All 3 types of regions can change over time. 50 years ago, as a formal region, Maricopa County, Arizona was the largest producer of agricultural products in America. Today, it grows mostly houses. A very famous functional region, America's ribbon of highway, called Route 66, is now mostly abandoned. And perceptual regions change. A desert area north of Phoenix in the 1920s was where folks sick with tuberculosis came looking for a cure. Locals called the TB patients lungers and avoided the lunger camps. Today, however, that geographic region is an upscale part of Phoenix and home to some of the finest resort hotels. Perhaps you've heard the phrase, "No man is an island," meaning we are all dependent on others. Well, the same is true with geography. Resources are scattered across the earth. No country has it all. So everyone has to trade with others. Today we are moving toward a global economy. Look around your grocery store. Fruits and vegetables are shipped in from wherever they are in season. Look at the labels on products. Electronics, coffee, toys, and clothing come from all over the world. And sometimes a project is like a joint venture. Certain parts might be manufactured in the US, then shipped to a plant called a maquiladora in Mexico, where it is assembled, then shipped back to the US for sale. Communications are changing the world. There was a time when a long-distance phone call, much less an international call, was quite expensive. And travel? In the 1920s, getting from Los Angeles to Paris took almost 2 weeks by train and by ship, and adjusted for inflation, it cost several $1,000s. Today, it takes maybe 10 hours, and at certain times of the year can be done round trip for $500 or $600. Ordering something over the internet or flying on a jet are things young people take for granted. And as travel and communications become easier and cheaper, the entire world is becoming one big shopping mall. Each of us has our own mental images of people and places. For example, the place called Arizona most likely conjures up an image of the dry Sonoran Desert, and that would be half wrong, because the state also has snow-covered mountains. But more important are the images of people. There may be people around the world you don't think very highly of. Sometimes these images are based on actual knowledge, but more often they're just negative stereotypes you've heard about. Certainly there are differing cultures and traditions, but as you have the opportunity to travel to distant lands, you learn that beneath the differences, people are just people. They want to have a job and a home, raise and educate their children, and hope for a better world for their grandchildren. Learning to accept and understand that is probably the most valuable lesson to be learned from the study of geography. As best we know, Earth is the only planet on our solar system that offers a range of climates suitable for human life to survive. Most people live in temperate locations, but even the places we call home can offer challenges to our survival. We've mentioned that hurricanes, earthquakes, and tornadoes are not preventable. If Earth had no people, these events wouldn't matter much. But Earth does have people, and natural disasters can cause deaths and cost billions of dollars. If we can do nothing to prevent a hurricane, some other disasters, such as floods, can at least be minimized by wise practices in how we farm, build dams, and dredge the channels of rivers. But if Earth's physical systems affect the experience of human life, it also works the other way around. Human society does plenty to modify the Earth's physical environment. To set the stage for a good example, let's first look at Arizona's river systems. Generally, in nature, rivers flow towards the ocean. The Colorado River comes from the north into Arizona. It is soon met and fed by the Little Colorado River that carries water from sources above the Mogollon Rim. The Colorado then cuts west through the Grand Canyon, across the Plateau, and then turns south the entire length of the state. Then there is another series of rivers in the east central and southeast part of the state: the Hassayampa, the Agua Fria, the Verde, the Salt, the San Simon, the San Pedro, and the Santa Cruz. All of these, through one route or another, feed into the Gila River that runs southwest across the Sonoran Desert to the city of Yuma, where it flows into the Colorado, which in turn continues south into the Gulf of California and ultimately to the Pacific Ocean. Of course, historically, the flow of water in these rivers was inconsistent at best, so in the 1860s, when settlers came into the hot, dry Salt River Valley and redug the old Hohokam irrigation ditches, they never knew whether to expect a trickle from the Salt River or a raging flood. The new little town called itself Phoenix. Now, for a few thousand people who didn't mind the summer heat, the absence of electricity, the lack of a railroad, and an undependable river, it was fine, but not a place with much of a future. And that's basically how it was for the next 30 or so years. Then around 1900, the farmers in the area asked the help of the U.S. government to undertake America's first major reclamation effort. The proposal was to construct what would be called Theodore Roosevelt Dam, 80 miles up on the Salt River. Over the decades, it would be followed by several other dams. What resulted became known as the Salt River Project, which created a stable water supply for people and farm crops, and also provided for hydro generation of electricity. But what it really did, along with the development of air conditioning, was to allow this desert valley to grow from a few thousand residents to more than 3 million. Worldwide, it is the classic example of man, in a constructive way, modifying the physical environment. Anytime man picks a spot on Earth to call home, it modifies the physical environment. Even pitching a tent for a day starts to kill off the grass on the ground beneath it. Of course, the greatest concern is with larger-scale actions undertaken in the name of progress. Agriculture and housing, for example, are necessary in every society, but the introduction of brick and mortar, pavement and sidewalks, or pesticides, tend to cause animals and birds and fish, and even insects to either find a new habitat or die. We build factories, but sometimes today, and very often in the past, the careless dumping of used chemicals pollute a water supply. In the mining industry, The use of acids to produce ore can have the same result. There are numerous examples of man having modified the physical world with inadequate concern for the long-term effects. We've all heard the expression, the straw that broke the camel's back. What is the total capacity of straw a camel can carry? Of course, that's just a metaphor, but in geography, we actually do use the term carrying capacity. Generally, we're talking about the use of our land, air, and water, and how much human population and activity it can support. 5,000 people settling into a big valley with 2,000 automobiles and a couple of factories is typically no problem. But what if it grows and grows? 5 million people with 2 million cars and thousands of factories. What is the carrying capacity of that valley? When does it get too crowded? When does pollution of air and water become a big problem? Or might you start running out of water? Well, unlike the camel's back, the valley doesn't suddenly break and die. Rather, there can be a decline in the quality of life. Smog, traffic, polluted water, crowded schools, crime, and on. Environmentally and socially, it can exceed its carrying capacity and become not such a great place to live. In the early 1970s in the US, we saw the beginnings of an environmental movement, citizens organizing to put pressure on government, business, industry, and on the people to take action. Environmental protection agencies were created, and whereas they admittedly do create certain financial and bureaucratic burdens, these efforts help keep up with the challenge of maintaining healthy land, air, and water, and protecting wildlife habitats even as populations continue to grow. During this program, we've learned that the study of geography is more than just knowing the difference between a mountain and a desert, more than just knowing how to locate the United States on a world map. Geography is about understanding planet Earth at the beginning of the 21st century. Certainly it's about all the natural processes, atmosphere, biosphere, ecosystems and how they work, but equally important, it is about the people who occupy the Earth. As we said earlier, if nobody lived here, the planet would happily spin along without a worry. But we do live here, 6 billion of us and more coming. Travel and communications and technology are making it a small place. As nations, we interact with each other. We depend on each other. And we have to get along with each other. If we don't, we run the risk of destroying each other, and maybe destroying Earth in the process. The solution, the best tool for keeping us and our world healthy, is very simple. It is a matter of understanding, accepting, appreciating and nurturing the delicate nature of our environment and our world neighbors. In other words, physical geography and cultural geography. We can't even imagine what scientific and technological developments will appear in the next 50 years. But whatever they are, they won't mean a thing if we haven't learned to take care of Earth and each other. Think about it. I'm Courtney McCune.